Imagine being just 6 years old, and handed over to a 29-year-old king as his wife. No childhood, no freedom, only a crown that felt heavier than life itself. This isn't fiction, it's the true story of a girl who became Queen of England, before she even understood what marriage meant. But what happened next was even more shocking. From betrayal and political games to a death so tragic that history almost erased her name forever, this is the story you were never told. And once you hear it, you'll never forget her. The story of England's forgotten queen begins not with her coronation or her tragic end, but with her childhood. Imagine being only 6 years old, still playing with dolls, barely able to understand the complicated politics of your time, and suddenly being told that you are now the wife of one of the most powerful kings in Europe. This was not a fairy tale, nor was it a story of love and romance. It was politics, power, and the heavy burden of duty placed upon the shoulders of a little girl who should have been free to live out her childhood. Her name was Isabella of Valois, the daughter of Charles VI of France, and her husband was King Richard II of England, a man almost 5 times her age. What brought them together was not love, but war, treaties, and the desperate hope of peace between two of the greatest kingdoms in medieval Europe. To understand how Isabella ended up in this strange and tragic position, we must first look at the world into which she was born. Europe in the late 14th century was a place of constant turmoil. The 100 Years' War between England and France was tearing both countries apart. Armies marched across fields, villages were burned, families were displaced, and thousands of lives were lost in battles that seemed endless. It was during this chaos that Isabella entered the world in 1389. Her father, King Charles VI of France, was known to his people as both a ruler and a man haunted by madness. At times, he could rule with intelligence and strength, but at other times, he descended into fits of insanity, believing he was made of glass or forgetting his own family members. This instability in the French royal household made Isabella's life all the more fragile, for she was a piece on a chessboard where kings, queens, and ministers moved her not out of care for her childhood, but out of ambition for their kingdoms. Richard, too, the man who would become her husband, was by then in a precarious position. He had been king since he was a child, inheriting the crown after the death of his grandfather, Edward III, and his father, the Black Prince. Richard grew up under the shadow of strong nobles who doubted his strength, his authority, and his ability to rule. By the time he was nearly 30, Richard was struggling to keep his throne secure. His relationship with his people was strained, and his enemies both at home and abroad looked for any weakness to exploit. To strengthen his position, Richard needed peace with France. He knew that endless war would not only drain his kingdom but also put his crown at greater risk. So he turned to diplomacy, and in those times, the greatest tool of diplomacy was marriage. This is how little Isabella became the focus of international negotiations. Richard's advisors and French diplomats began to speak of a union between England and France, sealed by the marriage of their monarchs. But there was a problem. Richard was nearly 30, and Isabella was a child, not even old enough to understand the meaning of marriage. Yet in medieval Europe, this did not matter. To them, what mattered was the treaty, the bond of peace, and the symbol that the marriage would represent. The French king, desperate for peace, agreed to give his young daughter to the English monarch, hoping that this would end decades of bloodshed. And so, while other children her age played in gardens and learned to read, Isabella of Valois was being prepared for a royal marriage that would shock both England and France. The negotiations lasted months. At first, the idea of Richard marrying a 6-year-old was mocked in England. Many of his nobles thought it absurd. How could a child queen bear heirs? How could she be a partner to the king? But Richard ignored their concerns. He saw Isabella not as a wife in the traditional sense but as a living treaty, a guarantee of peace. By marrying her, he could tie England to France and, perhaps, secure his throne against rebellion. Eventually, the terms were agreed upon. Isabella would be sent to England, a lavish dowry would be provided, and in return, Richard promised peace. The marriage ceremony itself was one of grandeur and spectacle. Isabella, dressed in fine silks and jewels far too heavy for her tiny frame, was paraded before the court and the people. Chroniclers wrote of her beauty, her innocence, and her youth. She was said to have looked like a porcelain doll, delicate and untouched by the harshness of the world she was entering. Richard, on the other hand, stood tall and regal, his age, in sharp contrast to the child by his side. For many who witnessed the union, it was a disturbing sight. But in those times, political necessity outweighed sentiment, and so the vows were spoken. The treaty was sealed, and Isabella became Queen of England at only 6 years old. Despite the disturbing nature of the marriage, Richard treated Isabella with surprising kindness. He did not force her into the role of a wife in the way many had feared. Instead, he treated her more like a daughter, lavishing her with gifts, jewels, and clothes. He built her a household of attendants and teachers, ensuring that she was raised in the English court with dignity. Some chroniclers even suggest that Richard grew genuinely fond of Isabella. seeing in her an innocence that softened his often troubled heart. But while Isabella was safe from physical harm, her childhood was still lost. She could not run free like other children. She was watched constantly, taught the behaviors of a queen, and burdened with the knowledge that she was the living symbol of peace between two nations. Meanwhile, Richard's rule in England was becoming more unstable. His nobles resented his extravagance and his reliance on peace with France. They accused him of being weak, of betraying the memory of English warriors who had fought and died in the 100 Years' War. Whispers of rebellion began to grow louder, and the marriage to Isabella, instead of uniting the kingdom, became another point of contention. Many English lords looked at the tiny queen and mocked the king, saying he had married a child because no real queen would have him. Richard ignored their insults, but the truth was clear. His position was growing, more dangerous with each passing year. For Isabella, the court of England was both a cage and a stage. She played her role as queen, appearing in ceremonies, attending banquets, and walking beside her much older husband. But behind the walls of the palace, she remained a child. She played with her ladies-in-waiting, practiced her lessons, and sometimes cried for her mother and father in France. She was trapped between two worlds, the innocence of childhood and the crushing responsibilities of queenship. Her story is a haunting reminder of how little choice royal children had in their destinies. As the years passed, the tension in England grew worse. Richard's enemies were gathering strength, and Isabella could sense the unease around her. Though she was still young, she was not blind to the whispers, the arguments, and the fear that rippled through the court. Her fate was tied to Richard's, and as the storm of rebellion closed in on him, the little queen found herself standing at the edge of a tragedy she could not comprehend. And so, as part one of this story draws to a close, we see Isabella of Valois at the beginning of her journey, a child bride, dressed in jewels too heavy for her small body, placed upon the throne of England beside a king twice her age, and thrust into a world of politics, betrayal, and danger. She did not choose this life, but it had been chosen for her. The peace she symbolized was fragile, and the storm clouds over England were gathering fast. What awaited her was not the fairy tale ending of a queen adored by her people, but a path of loss, sorrow, and survival that would mark her as one of the most forgotten, yet most tragic queens in history. The marriage of little Isabella to Richard II might have been intended as a bond of peace, but in truth, it became a fragile thread holding together two nations weary of war. England had hoped for calm, yet unrest grew stronger with every passing season. For Isabella, the glittering crown placed upon her head was less a symbol of honor and more a chain that bound her to the fate of a man standing on a crumbling throne. Though Richard showered her with kindness, her presence could not heal the deep divisions in England. And as she grew slightly older, still a child but aware enough to notice fear in the air, she began to realize that her story was not going to be one of fairy tale queenship but of tragedy and survival. Richard II's enemies were everywhere. His court was full of suspicion, nobles plotting in whispers and allies turning uncertain. The great families of England had grown tired of his extravagance, his obsession with luxury, and his determination to rule without their consent. He loved art, fashion, and ceremony, and he envisioned himself as a majestic ruler in the style of European kings. But England was not France, and his nobility did not tolerate a king who ignored their counsel. They saw him as arrogant and disconnected from the common people. Worst of all, they believed that Richard was betraying England's proud military tradition by seeking peace with France, the very nation with which they had fought for generations. The child bride from Valois, though innocent, became an easy target for their scorn. Too many nobles, Isabella was a living reminder of Richard's weakness. Despite the political storm, Richard continued to treat Isabella with a certain tenderness. He made sure she lived in comfort, surrounded by attendants, jewels, and fine clothes. He often visited her, not as a husband seeking a wife, but almost as a father admiring his daughter. Chroniclers recorded that he would speak kindly to her, playfully call her his little queen, and promise her that one day she would grow into her role with grace. Isabella, still far too young to grasp the complexities of her position, cherished these moments. To her, Richard was not a tyrant or a failing ruler. He was the familiar presence in a strange land, the one who ensured she was cared for. But even in these moments of warmth, the walls of politics and danger pressed closer. Outside the palace, England simmered with unrest. In 1399, Richard's greatest challenge would rise in the form of his cousin, Henry. Henry was the son of John of Gaunt, one of the most powerful nobles in England, and a man whose wealth and influence rivaled that of the king himself. For years, Richard had clashed with Henry and his allies, but when John of Gaunt died, Richard made a fatal mistake. Instead of allowing Henry to inherit his father's vast estates, Richard seized them for himself. This decision outraged the nobility, who saw it as a direct violation of the ancient rights of inheritance. It was the spark that Henry needed, the justification for rebellion, and the excuse for many discontented nobles to rise against the king. When Henry returned to England from exile, he did not declare himself as a usurper at first. He claimed he only wanted his rightful inheritance. But as his army grew larger and his supporters more numerous, it became clear that he sought more than land. He wanted the crown itself. Richard, caught unprepared, struggled to rally his forces. Many of his supposed allies abandoned him, and those who had once sworn loyalty now turned to Henry. Isabella, though only 10 years old by this time, could not help but sense the tension. She saw the hurried councils, the anxious faces of her attendants, and the whispers that passed like shadows through the halls. She may not have known the details of politics, but she felt the fear that hung in the air like smoke before a fire. Richard tried to resist, but his efforts were futile. Betrayed by many of his own nobles, he was eventually captured and forced to surrender. Isabella's world, once filled with silk gowns and jewels, suddenly grew darker. The man who had been her protector, the king who had called her his little queen, was now a prisoner of his enemies. For Isabella, the confusion must have been overwhelming. One day she was the Queen of England, adored by her husband and honored at court, and the next she was little more than a pawn in a kingdom that no longer wanted her. Richard was imprisoned in Pontefract Castle, a bleak fortress far from the splendor of London. Isabella was not allowed to see him. She asked, she begged, she cried for permission to visit, but her pleas were ignored. For a child whose understanding of marriage was built not on romance but on affection and protection, this sudden separation was devastating. She may have been young, but she knew that something was terribly wrong. And though Richard remained alive for a time, rumors swirled around her that he would not survive long in the hands of Henry Bolingbroke. Those rumors proved true. In early 1400, Richard II was dead. Whether he was starved, murdered, or left to waste away remains uncertain, but the result was the same. The man who had been Isabella's guardian, her husband, her king, was gone. Henry Bolingbroke had taken the throne as Henry IV, and England now had no use for the child queen of Valois. Isabella's position was suddenly precarious. She was too young to play a meaningful political role, yet too important to simply be discarded. Henry IV offered to arrange another marriage for her, this time to his son, the young Prince of Wales, who would later become the famous Henry V for Henry. Marrying Isabella to his son would both secure peace with France and legitimize his new reign, but Isabella refused. Her refusal is one of the most remarkable parts of her story. Though barely 11 years old, Isabella stood firm. She declared that she was still Richard's widow, that she would not betray his memory by marrying the son of the man who had stolen his crown and, perhaps, his life. Chroniclers describe her as grieving deeply for Richard, mourning him in a way that was far beyond her years. She dressed in widow's clothing, avoided public appearances, and spent her days in quiet sorrow. To some, she was merely a child acting out the role expected of her, but to others, she showed a strength and loyalty rare, even among adults. Her defiance angered Henry IV, but it also earned her respect. In a court full of treachery and shifting loyalties, the tiny queen who refused to abandon her husband's memory became a symbol of dignity. Yet for all her courage, Isabella was still trapped. Henry could not force her into marriage, but he would not allow her to return to France easily either. She became a prisoner in all but name, confined in England while Henry negotiated with her family. For months, perhaps even years, she lingered. In uncertainty, caught between two kingdoms, her attendants tried to comfort her, but she longed for her homeland, for the familiar voices of her mother and father, and for freedom from the shadows of English politics. She was no longer queen, no longer wife, but she was not yet allowed to be a child again. Eventually, under pressure from France, Henry agreed to send Isabella home. When she finally returned, she was older, wiser, and marked forever by her experiences in England. She was still only 12 years old, yet she had lived through more than many adults. She had been a queen, a widow, and a political prisoner. She had seen love in the kindness of Richard, cruelty in the betrayal of nobles, and courage in her own refusal to bend to Henry's will. She carried these memories with her, and though she would later marry again in France, she never forgot. Her time in England, her return was bittersweet. She was back with her family, surrounded by familiar sights and sounds, but she was changed. She had lost her innocence too early, forced to wear the heavy crown of politics before she even understood its meaning. She was remembered in France, not as a tragic child bride, but as a symbol of endurance. To the French people, she was the young queen who had faced the storms of England and survived. Yet for history, she would become one of the forgotten queens, overshadowed by the great figures of the 100 Years' War and by the kings who fought for power. The story of Isabella of Valois is not one of victory or conquest, but of resilience. In her youth, she endured burdens that should never have been placed on a child. She witnessed betrayal, rebellion, and death. Yet she held on to her dignity. She may not have wielded armies or commanded courts, but her quiet refusal to betray Richard's memory speaks louder than the deeds of many rulers. For Isabella, the crown was not a gift, but a chain. And yet, even in her captivity, she found a way to stand firm. When Isabella finally stepped onto French soil again, the air felt lighter, freer, though her heart remained heavy. She was 12 years old, but she did not return as the same child who had left years earlier. The girl who had once been led by the hand into the great halls of Westminster now walked back into Paris as a widow, clothed in black, her face marked by sorrow far beyond her age. To the French, she was not merely the daughter of King Charles VI anymore, she was the young widow of a fallen English king, the child queen who had endured humiliation, captivity, and grief. Her return was met with both sympathy and solemnity. But behind the courtiers' gentle words and warm welcomes lay the same currents of politics that had always defined her life. Her mother, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, embraced her with tears. But even in this moment of reunion, Isabella could sense the weight of expectations pressing down. France was still embroiled in its own troubles. Her father, Charles VI, known to history as the Mad King, drifted in and out of lucidity, leaving the kingdom vulnerable to infighting among powerful dukes. The Valois court was fractured between rival factions, each seeking to control the throne. Isabella's return added both relief and complication to this tense situation. On one hand, she was safe from England. On the other, she was a political asset. Once more her hand in marriage was still valuable, her name still tied to power. For now, however, Isabella was allowed a period of mourning. She withdrew into a quieter life at the French court, where she surrounded herself with ladies-in-waiting and clung to her memories of Richard. Chroniclers describe how she wore her widow's garb with unshakable resolve, rejecting jewels, colors, and the glittering displays of the court. At times, people whispered that she was too young to truly understand grief, but others believed she felt it more deeply because of her innocence. In Richard she had found not passion, but kindness. Not love in the sense of a wife, but affection that comforted a frightened child in a foreign land. His death had taken away the one figure of stability she had known during her years in England. For Isabella, mourning was not simply an act of duty, it was genuine sorrow. Months turned into years, and Isabella slowly blossomed into adolescence. She grew into a young woman of striking beauty, carrying herself with the poise that her upbringing had instilled in her. Yet she retained a certain gravity, a sense of seriousness that came from the burdens she had carried so young. Courtiers admired her for it. To some, she was a symbol of endurance. To others, she was still a tool waiting to be used. For though she had returned home, the politics of her future could not be ignored forever. It was inevitable that new suitors would be considered for her hand. France was always in need of alliances, and Isabella's status as both a princess of Valois and a former queen of England made her valuable. But Isabella herself was wary. Having been married once before, she did not wish to be used as a pawn again. She resisted proposals, clinging to her widowhood, determined not to betray Richard's memory too soon. Yet in the turbulent world of royal courts, resistance could only last so long. By the time Isabella reached the age of 16, discussions of her remarriage grew serious. One suitor above all others emerged. Charles, Duke of Orleans, the son of the powerful Louis of Orleans and nephew to the French king. The match was not only politically advantageous but also one that carried personal promise. Charles was closer in age to Isabella, unlike Richard who had been 23 years her senior. More importantly, Charles was known for his gentle nature, his love of poetry, and his cultured demeanor. He was not the hardened warrior type, nor the ruthless schemer, but a man who appreciated art, literature, and beauty. For Isabella, who had lived through the cold machinery of political marriages, the prospect of marrying someone closer to her own sensibilities was a glimmer of hope. The marriage negotiations proceeded swiftly. By 1406, Isabella and Charles were wed in a ceremony that was both lavish and symbolic. This time, she was not a 6-year-old child being led to a foreign king, but a young woman entering into a union with a man closer to her own age and culture. For the first time in her life, Isabella had a chance at something resembling normality, or at least as normal as a royal marriage could be. She embraced her new role with grace, and in Charles she found a companion who treated her with kindness and respect. Their marriage, however, unfolded against a backdrop of chaos. France was sliding deeper into turmoil. The rivalry between the Burgundians and the Armagnacs threatened to tear the kingdom apart, and the English remained an ever-present danger across the Channel. But within the walls of their household, Isabella and Charles found brief moments of peace. They shared a love of poetry and courtly refinement, and though Isabella carried the scars of her childhood, she allowed herself to hope for a gentler future. It was said that she began to laugh again, that the widow's gloom, which had defined her early years in France, slowly gave way to cautious joy. Yet fate was not done with Isabella. The years of political stress and personal grief had taken their toll on her health. In 1409, only 3 years after her marriage to Charles, Isabella gave birth to a daughter. It should have been a moment of triumph, a symbol of new beginnings, but instead, it marked the end of her fragile hope. The pregnancy was difficult, and complications during childbirth left her weak and broken. Isabella did not recover. At only 19 years of age, the young woman who had once been Queen of England, the girl who had carried herself with dignity through loss and betrayal, passed away. Her life had been short, filled with more sorrow than joy, and yet her story left a lingering mark on those who remembered her. Her death was mourned deeply by Charles, who later became one of France's greatest poets. His verses, written during his long captivity after the Battle of Agincourt, carried echoes of the love he had shared with Isabella. Though he would remarry, Isabella remained his first wife, his youthful companion, the queen who had endured too much, too soon. In her daughter, their brief union lived on, though even she would not escape the turbulence of the age. Isabella's story, in many ways, is a tale of what it meant to be a woman in medieval royalty. She was born into privilege, but that privilege came at a cost. From the age of 6, her life was dictated by politics, her childhood stripped away in the name of peace. She endured separation, grief, and the loss of innocence. Yet she carried herself with quiet strength, unlike the queens who are remembered for wielding armies or shaping dynasties. Isabella is remembered for her dignity, her refusal to bend when pressured to betray her heart, and her ability to endure pain with grace. She was, in truth, forgotten by many historians, overshadowed by the louder figures of her time. Yet, when we pause to hear her story, it speaks to something universal, the resilience of the human spirit in the face of forces beyond one's control. Looking back at her journey, one cannot help but imagine the lonely child who left France at 6 years old, clutching the hand of strangers, entering a foreign land where she was expected to be queen. One cannot help but picture the young widow, barely 11, refusing to marry her husband's usurper, standing firm in her grief while surrounded by powerful men who sought to use her. And one cannot help but mourn the young woman of 19, who finally found companionship and love, only to have it taken from her in death. Isabella of Valois lived a short life, but every chapter was marked by extraordinary weight. She did not rule, she did not conquer, but she endured, and in enduring, she left behind a story that still moves us centuries later. When Isabella of Valois breathed her last in 1409, the French court fell into mourning, though for many it was only a brief pause in the ongoing chaos of their fractured kingdom. She was only 19, a young woman who had lived her entire life at the mercy of dynastic struggles. Her death seemed almost like a whisper against the roar of political storms, easily overlooked in chronicles that preferred to record battles and kings. Yet for those who knew her, for her husband, Charles of Orleans, and even for the English who remembered the small girl once called their queen, Isabella's passing carried a heavy sense of loss. Her funeral was solemn, befitting her royal blood. She was buried with the dignity of a princess of France and a queen dowager of England, her name inscribed among those of her powerful ancestors. But even in death, her story was tinged with tragedy. She left behind no sons to secure her memory. In the dynastic line, only a single daughter, Jean, survived her. That daughter, barely a newborn when Isabella died, would carry her legacy into the next generation. But she too would live in the shadow of the tumultuous times. For Charles of Orleans, Isabella's death was more than the loss of a wife. It was the shattering of a fragile hope. Their marriage, brief as it was, had been a rare sanctuary in a life destined for turbulence. Charles, still a young man, had adored Isabella. When she died, he was left with an emptiness that would linger throughout his life. He eventually remarried, as was expected of him, but Isabella remained his first true companion, the one who had shared with him the fragile beginnings of adulthood. Later, when he was captured at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415 and spent decades as a prisoner in England, his poetry often spoke of love, longing, and sorrow. Scholars believe that in some of those verses, echoes of Isabella could still be heard, veiled in metaphor and rhyme, a tribute to the girl queen whose memory haunted him. Her daughter Jean, though a small child when her mother died, grew into a woman who embodied the complicated legacy of her parents. She married John II of Alencon, another important figure in the shifting tides of French nobility. Through her, Isabella's bloodline continued, woven into the intricate web of French aristocracy. Yet Jean, like her mother, would never truly escape the tragedies of her time. The wars that plagued France, the rivalries that tore noble families apart, and the constant threat of English domination shaped her life as much as they had shaped Isabella's. In many ways, Isabella's daughter was a continuation of the same story, a woman caught in the machinery of power, her personal joys and sorrows overshadowed by dynastic necessity. But if Isabella's immediate legacy was her daughter, her deeper legacy was the way her story became a mirror of the vulnerabilities of queenship itself. She had been used as a political pawn, her childhood bartered away for the sake of peace between France and England. She had been married off to a man more than 2 decades her senior, a king who treated her kindly, but who died before she had even reached adolescence. She had been thrust into widowhood before she could understand what it meant to be a wife. She had been pressured to remarry her husband's usurper, Henry IV, and when she refused, She risked her safety to preserve her dignity, and then, after a brief chance at happiness with Charles of Orleans, she was taken by death before she could even reach her 20s. All of it: the marriage at 6, the widowhood at 11, the remarriage at 16, and the death at 19. How royal women were never given the chance to live for themselves. Their lives were dictated by crowns, treaties, and swords. Their bodies used as vessels for peace and heirs. To the English, Isabella was a fleeting figure. She had been their queen for only a few short years, and as a child she had never truly reigned. After Richard's death and her return to France, her memory faded quickly in England. The chroniclers who wrote about Richard II often mentioned her with sympathy, describing her grief and her refusal to marry Henry IV as a mark of her character. But in the larger scope of English history, she was little more than a footnote, overshadowed by the men who fought for thrones and glory. Yet for those who look closely, Isabella's story offers a poignant glimpse into the human cost of those struggles. In France, she was remembered with more tenderness, but even there, her legacy was diluted by the turbulence of her era. The French court was consumed with the madness of Charles VI, the rise of the Burgundians, and the 100 Years' War. Isabella's quiet dignity was easily lost amidst the noise of blood and politics. It was Charles of Orleans who kept her memory alive most vividly, not through grand monuments or political acts, but through poetry, the language of the heart. His words, written in captivity, carried her name, not openly, but in spirit, woven into the laments of a man who had loved and lost too young. And yet, centuries later, when historians began to dig deeper into the lives of forgotten queens, Isabella's story emerged once more. Scholars began to see her not as a mere footnote but as a symbol of the silent sacrifices of medieval women. Her life revealed the cruelty of child marriages, the sorrow of being a widow before adolescence, and the quiet strength of resisting the demands of powerful men. In her refusal to marry Henry IV, she demonstrated a courage that few expected. Of a child, in her loyalty to Richard's memory, she showed a heart unbroken by the pressures of politics. In her brief happiness with Charles of Orleans, she showed that even within the confines of duty, there could be moments of love. And in her early death, she became a symbol of how fragile life was for even the most privileged of women. The tragedy of Isabella of Valois lies not only in what she endured, but in what she never had the chance to experience. She never had the freedom to choose her own path. She never saw adulthood fully bloom. She never lived to see peace in the kingdoms that fought over her. She was born to be a queen, raised to be a pawn, and remembered, when she was remembered at all, as a girl whose life ended too soon. But in that short life, she displayed a strength of spirit that deserves to be remembered. That, as we look back on her story, now centuries later, we cannot help but reflect on the broader question of history. How many voices have been silenced? How many lives reduced to footnotes, simply because they did not fit the narrative of kings and battles? Isabella's story reminds us that history is not only made by those who wield power, but also by those who endure it. Her endurance, her dignity, and her quiet defiance give us a glimpse of the human heart beneath the crowns and treaties. She may not have changed the course of wars or shaped the destiny of nations, but she lived, she suffered, and she loved, and that is a story worth telling. Perhaps that is why, when we hear of Isabella of Valois today, the title most often attached to her is not one of power, but of sorrow, the forgotten queen. Yet to remember her now is to undo that forgetting. To speak her name, to tell her tale, is to honor the young girl who walked bravely into England at 6, who mourned her husband at 11, who resisted a king at 12, who married again at 16, and who died at 19. Isabella's story, brief as it was, holds the weight of an entire era's truths. In her, we see the cost of ambition, the fragility of peace, and the strength of the human soul. Her ghost lingers not in the battlefields of Agincourt or the grand halls of Westminster, but in the quiet image of a young queen who never had the chance to grow old, who remains forever a symbol of innocence, entangled in power. And in remembering her, we remember the countless others whose stories, though quieter, are just as essential to the tapestry of history.